Hi, Galvanin. Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and wrapping up the Silmarillion Synopsis series, we now come to the final chapter of the Third Age and the Rings of Power. Now, this is not actually the last video I'm going to do. I'm planning to do a video where I do literally the entire Silmarillion in one video, very, very condensed, but that'll probably be a little ways off. I need to do a few shorter videos. This has been challenging project, let's just say. So this will be the last one for a while, but there will be one more coming, just so you know. This chapter, even though it's titled Of the Third Age and the Rings of Power, actually kind of starts us at the end of the First Age, covers a little bit of the Second Age, and then ends in the Third Age. So it kind of hits all the bases. So let's go ahead and get started. We begin at the end of the First Age, essentially, with Sauron experiencing the defeat of Morgoth. It tells us that Sauron is the greatest and most trusted of Morgoth's servants, but at the end, when he is defeated and cast outside the doors of night, Sauron apparently repents, and it tells us that this is maybe feigned, but also it might be genuine, if only out of fear. Basically, like, well, if that's what the Valar can do and what they're willing to do, then I'm gonna change sides, essentially, is what it tells us. But when he comes to Eonwe, who led the host of the Valar against Morgoth, Eonwe basically tells him, I don't have the power to pardon you. You've got to come back to Valinor and stand judgment before the Valar. And Sauron doesn't really like that idea, because he doesn't want to, say, end up like Morgoth did, before all this got started, and maybe have to be imprisoned for several, ages, and then get a chance for parole. So he decides, well, I'm just going to hide out in Middle-earth for a while and not go back to Valinor. And so he does. Sauron began to turn back to his evil ways, assuming, of course, that he had genuinely left them. But meanwhile, the elves that remained in Middle-earth mainly set up their realm in the where we know of the Grey Havens, which is, the land is called Lindon, and of course they're under Gil-galad as king, and with him lives Elrond. Some of these elves end up going east over the mountains, the Misty Mountains, or even just between the Eredlu and the Blue Mountains and the Misty Mountains. Most of the ones who pass over the Misty Mountains are Teleri, and they end up becoming lords and kings of Sylvan elves who, never even made it to Beleriand. So this would be like Thranduil from The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. He would be one of the Telerin elves from Beleriand who went east and became king of elves who had never even come as far west as Beleriand. So that's one example of that. Galadriel, of course, would be another example. She eventually makes her way to Lothlorien, and it tells us that the only lasting realm of the Noldor, other than Lindon, where the Grey Havens are, is Eregion. And Eregion is, which there's a brief reference to Eregion, well, a couple of brief references to Eregion in the Lord of the Rings, so you may remember that, but it's basically right next to Khazad-dûm. It's, the elven realm of Eregion is literally next door to the dwarven realm. And the Noldor there, because the Noldor are a lot more in nature like dwarves, they have a really good friendship with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, and they end up having, a really good friendship and commercial relationship and everything else. And it tells us that this level of friendship between elf and dwarf never arises anywhere else and never has arisen anywhere else. And the elves here are basically led by Celebrimbor, who you may remember from way back when Nargothrond was still standing. He's the son of Curufin, who ended up rejecting Curufin because of his bad deeds. But he inherited a lot of Feanor's skill and whatnot, and Celebrimbor, along with several other skilled smiths in Eregion, become kind of a very significant group of smiths, and there's other documents that Tolkien leaves behind that goes a little bit more into detail about their stuff, but here we just get a brief overview of the fact that they're a very important group, and they do a lot of smithing and learning a lot more about their craft, and become some of the greatest of craftsmen of the Noldor ever since Feanor. And that kind of starts to lead into, you can guess, the Rings of Power. Before we quite get to the Rings of Power, we have to go back to Sauron. Sauron, of course, is going back to his evil ways. He hates Numenor because their ancestors helped defeat Morgoth and, by extension, himself. He also doesn't really like the elves. He's not powerful enough to attack them outright yet, and so he decides that he's going to try to deceive them. He takes on a fair form, calling himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and he tries to go among elves to try to sway them to his way of thinking by deceit more than by force. And in some places, he's more successful than others. It tells us that Gil-galad and Elrond basically reject him, even though they're not sure who he is. They really just don't trust him. But he also begins turning men to evil in the east and all this sort of thing. But he is accepted in Eregion, where, much like Morgoth way back in the day could kind of give information and secrets to the Noldor who were more willing to accept that, here the same kind of thing happens again, and the smiths in Eregion and Celebrimbor himself kind of look at this Anatar figure as somebody who can really help them develop their craft. And so he teaches them how to do Rings of Power, and they begin crafting these things. Meanwhile, of course, Sauron has his own hidden agenda, of course, but the Rings of Power project becomes kind of the culmination of this Smith group. This is like the biggest thing that they ever managed to achieve. And Sauron, of course, meanwhile, is hiding his true identity. Nobody actually knows that he's, Morgoth's once upon a time second in command. But they're learning all this from Sauron, and they're meanwhile, Sauron is also spreading bad ideas, much like Morgoth did back in Valinor before he killed the trees. Sauron's kind of giving this idea of, why don't we make Middle-earth just as good as Valinor? And, it's too bad Gil-galad and Elrond are, not willing to do that. They just want to keep all the happiness to themselves. And he's doing this whole seeds of dissension thing, kind of like Morgoth did. So we're getting a bit of a recapitulation. Of course, Sauron's hidden agenda is to use the Rings of Power to dominate everybody else. He, of course, forges the One during this period, and you have to remember all this takes place in the Second Age, roughly the middle of the Second Age, around 1500. A lot of this stuff happens 1600, somewhere in that neighborhood. He forges the One Ring in Mount Doom, and planning to use that to basically dominate everybody else who has a Ring of Power. But when he puts on the ring, the elves who have their own Rings of Power, the three, they become aware of him immediately, and they take off their rings, realizing that they've been deceived and trapped. Sauron, realizing that he's been discovered, basically just goes off on a rage and begins open war. And in this open war, he conquers most of Middle-earth, and including Eregion. He basically lays Eregion waste, just completely destroys it, and in the process captures the 7 and 9 rings that would become the dwarves and rings of the Nazgul eventually. And Celebrimbor is also killed, but not before he manages to hide away the 3 rings. And as we will find out later, of course, they end up eventually in the hands of Elrond, Círdan, and Galadriel. Círdan will end up giving his to Gandalf, but he gives them away before he's killed, and so Sauron is kind of peeved at the fact that he doesn't get these rings, which are the only rings he didn't have a hand in making, and therefore they're not, even though they're subject to the power of the One, they're not inherently corruptive. He had a hand in making the 7 and the 9, so they're a little bit more by nature evil. But at any rate, after he recovers the 7 and the 9, and the way it reads, by the way, is it implies almost that the 7 and the 9 are almost undifferentiated, and he just happens to give more to men because they're more susceptible to domination. So it's kind of interesting to read this passage, because it almost makes you wonder if at this stage Tolkien's idea of what the rings were was a little different. But at any rate, he gives 7 to dwarves, and this doesn't turn out too well. Dwarves, by their nature, because of how Aule made them, are not really susceptible to domination of another will, and they also don't wraithify. One of the things that Gandalf tells us in The Lord of the Rings is that anybody who possesses a ring of power long enough will eventually become a wraith. But the dwarves don't do that, because they're just made to be really hard enduring, stubborn. That's just how they are. Men, however, do prove much more susceptible to Sauron's domination, and we get the 9 Nazgul eventually out of that, 3 of whom we are told are Númenóreans that we learned in the previous chapter on the Akalabath. The Dwarven rings do, however, lead to some bad problems for the dwarves, because the dwarves essentially use them as tools of their greed to gain more wealth, which attracts dragons, and dragons plunder their hoards and ruin their kingdoms, and basically what ends up happening is ultimately dragons either devour some of the 7 rings and the rest of them come back to Sauron, although it appears he never gives them out again, so it's not really clear that that ends up helping him much. Sauron, however, is now determined to absolutely wipe out the elves, and again he's making all this open war, and it tells us that this period is called the Black Years, or the Years of Flight, and many elves are sailing west from the Grey Havens at this point, trying to escape. But he hasn't yet worked up enough power to attack Gil-galad, who is being aided by Númenor, which is, as we learned in the Akalabath, powerful enough that they can just trounce Sauron. And he doesn't really know this yet, but he at least knows he doesn't have the power to overcome Gil-galad. During this period, Elrond also sets up the fortress of Rivendell. We don't usually think of Rivendell as a fortress, but that's what it was originally. And eventually, of course, we do have the Númenóreans come over and take Sauron hostage. And during that period, there's a stay in his hostilities because he's not there to lead his subjects. And when he comes back from Númenor, as we learned in the Akalabath, he finds that Gil-galad's power has extended in his absence beyond even the Misty Mountains to the borders of Greenwood, which we will know as Mirkwood. And so at this point, he kind of bides his time in Mordor and plans further war, which he's not ready to make yet. Of course, we get a brief reference to the aftermath of the downfall of Númenor here, telling us that Elendil and his sons escape the downfall of Númenor. Elendil lands in the north near where Gil-galad is, and he ends up setting up the realm of Arnor with 3 of the Palantiri. Isildur and Anarion end up landing further to the south and set up the realm of Gondor with 2 Palantiri each. And it tells us that Isildur and Anarion basically co-rule the realm of Gondor. Each has their own tower. Isildur sets up Minas Ithil. Anarion ends up with Minas Anor, which will later be Minas Tirith. But they both co-rule in Osgiliath, where they have thrones set up next to each other. And the White Tree is planted in Minas Ithil. Elendil, of course, is up north. He's doing his own thing, and it tells us that he will occasionally go to the Emin Bereid, which is the Tower Hills, where he will sometimes look into the Palantir that he has there, hoping to see in the west the havens of Avalone on Tol Eressëa, again getting that glimpse of the always looking back to the glory days of Númenor and what they had lost. But their kingdoms grow, and they're pretty substantial right off the bat because there were already a bunch of faithful who had fled to Middle-earth, and they basically become kings of people who were already there. And so the people who escaped Númenor is not the only people that are already in these realms from Númenor. There had been many that had fled in the persecutions beforehand, so their kingdoms become pretty powerful. Soon enough, it becomes clear that Sauron had returned to power in Mordor, and in fact, it tells us that he takes on a very terrible form. He's no longer capable, as we learned in the Akalabath, of actually taking on a fair-seeming form, and it tells us that at this point, the malice of his eye few can endure, which of course we also learned from the Akalabath. And this is one of those things, like the eye of Sauron is not flaming ball up on the tower. It's his literal eye. It's an eye in his body. But anyway, he begins to move. He begins to muster all his forces, which includes evil Númenóreans further to the south who lead the Haradrim, one of whom is named Herumor, and I won't ask you to remember that, but if you do, it'll be useful because there's a video I'm planning in the future that will refer back to that name. But at any rate, he begins to muster his forces, and he eventually attacks. He takes the Tower of Minas Ithil and burns it, but Isildur escapes with his family and a seedling of the tree, which is destroyed there as well, and he sails north to Elendil's realm of Arnor to seek aid, because he knows that Anarion won't be able to hold out in Gondor forever by himself. Elendil and Gil-galad form the last alliance of elves and men, and they march with a huge host, which it tells us is the most glorious since the days of the First Age when Valar marched upon Morgoth for the last time. And they march east of the Misty Mountains after mustering at Rivendell, and then south towards the Dagorlad, which is basically the huge plain in front of the Black Gates. And there they have a huge battle with Sauron's forces, which they defeat, and they eventually pass into Mordor itself and begin to lay siege to the Barad-dûr. In the plain of Gorgoroth in Mordor, Anarion is killed, and eventually things become so dire for Sauron that he himself comes out to fight and ends up fighting with Gil-galad and Elendil, and they both kill him, but he also kills them, and the sword of Elendil, Narsil, breaks under him as he dies. Isildur takes the hilt shard and uses it to cut the ring from Sauron's finger, and his spirit departs from his body, and it tells us it does not take shape for a long time into the future. Finally, we get to the Third Age, where it tells us that Isildur, after the battle, returns to Minas Anor, where he plants the seedling of the tree in memory of his brother, but he himself ends up returning north to the realm of Arnor, or plans to. Of course, we know that he's going to die on the way. He refuses to destroy the ring, basically saying that, well, didn't I give Sauron his death blow? And that's something we don't get in The Lord of the Rings, and it's really interesting, so it makes you wonder exactly how that worked out. You know, was the death blow him cutting the ring off the finger, or was it him killing him after Gil-galad and Elendil had already been killed? It's not really clear. It doesn't go into detail. But at any rate, it does tell us that after this period in the Third Age, men and elves become estranged, partially because during the battle, of course, there were men fighting on behalf of Sauron and men fighting on behalf of the elves, and it's like the elves just kind of don't really trust men a whole lot anymore. And of course, Elrond is, tries to convince him along with Círdan to destroy the ring, and he doesn't, so they have other reasons not necessarily to trust men all that much, but this is the last time, of course, that you'll have a huge full-scale alliance between elves and men. Isildur leaves the realm of Gondor in the hands of Anarion's son, travels to the north, but of course is killed, and the ring is lost. Isildur's squire Ohtar escapes with the shards of Narsil to Rivendell, where Elrond is, and basically tells him what happened. And Elrond says, well, the sword won't be reforged until, there's basically another huge war with Sauron and the ring is found. And everybody was kind of hoping that wouldn't happen. They were hoping Sauron was totally defeated, but basically Sauron said, gosh, I can't get my name straight. Elrond says, if either of those two things happen, that'll be when this sword is reforged. The realm of Arnor in the north, there's so few people left after the huge war with Sauron. It tells us that the realm begins to kind of fall apart and decay. It eventually breaks into 3 petty kingdoms, which I've done a video on the history of Arnor before. I can link to that in the description below if you're interested. But eventually it kind of collapses. But the line of Isildur never fails, and he always has an heir. And these heirs are fostered in the home of Elrond. They are basically, treated as his foster children, or at least in the case of Aragorn, because he's actually orphaned. His father's killed, but even the ones that aren't, they're raised there just as a means of protecting them against the servants of Sauron, who are still out there. There's still a lot of men, it tells us, and other orcs, of course, who remember their defeat at the hands of the West and really don't like them. So the heirs of Isildur are protected basically by their fostering in Imladris or Rivendell. Gondor, however, continues for quite a while, and at first its glory grows, and at times even recalls the glory of Numenor, but of course it never reaches that level. But eventually the realm of Gondor itself will eventually collapse to a degree that the watch on Mordor fails. There's a plague that kills off a lot of people. Minas Ithil is deserted, and after it's deserted, the ring wraiths come out of Mordor and take it for their own, and it becomes Minas Morgul, a place of dread that nobody wants to go near. Osgiliath itself becomes deserted and becomes a city of ghosts, it tells us. It's not exactly clear what that means, but it's a really interesting phrase. And eventually the line of Anarion will fail. The last king of Gondor will ride off to basically have a one-on-one duel with the Lord of the Nazgul, and, well, it doesn't go well. He's just taken and never returned for obvious reasons, and eventually stewards rule the kingdom of Gondor. And during this rule of the stewards, we get the Rohirrim, who come from the north, help them in a huge battle against Easterlings, and are given basically as a reward the area of Calanarthon, which of course becomes known as Rohan, as a new home in perpetual alliance with Gondor. Elrond during this period basically gathers many of the wise and great to Rivendell, and Rivendell becomes kind of a source of wisdom and lore. And of course, Elrond is basically the greatest lore master of them all. And during this period, you have a lot of things going on, but Sauron doesn't really come back until roughly 1000 of the Third Age. And at that point, uh, the realm of Gondor is still, active and whatnot, but it's not, it's not to the waning period yet for Gondor. Arnor, I think, is even still in existence at the time that this happens. But when Sauron comes to Greenwood, he sets up as the necromancer or sorcerer of Dol Guldur, and at that point the forest becomes renamed Mirkwood because there's a lot of evil things growing in there in the south of the forest, which is, the opposite end of where Thranduil's realm is, and a lot of evil things, and just parts of the forest become very dark, and nobody knows exactly who this is at this point, but they all know that he is at least a threat. It's around this time that the Istari, or the wizards, come from Valinor into Middle-earth, and they come via way of the Grey Havens. And so Círdan knows where they come from, but he only tells Elrond and Galadriel of, basically their origins, and so most everybody else doesn't really know where they came from. It tells us that two of them went into the east and never really come into these stories. Those are, of course, the blue wizards. Gandalf just kind of wanders around, mostly among the elves, and doesn't have a lasting home. Saruman, it tells us at one point, does go into the east briefly and then returns and eventually sets up a permanent base at Isengard. And Radagast basically spends most of his time with animals. But, they're all trying to combat the evil of Sauron, and this is basically they're sent in response to his return. Gandalf, it tells us, is the first one to really suspect that the sorcerer of Dol Guldur is in fact Sauron, but at first Saruman particularly, but others are not really quite sure. Gandalf eventually actually goes to Dol Guldur to check it out, and whoever the sorcerer is flees, and at that point there's a watchful peace for quite some time. Sauron eventually returns, however, and more evil and stronger than before, and at this point the White Council is formed with Gandalf, Elrond, Galadriel, Saruman, maybe a few others, but basically the White Council begins at this second return of Sauron. Galadriel wants Gandalf to be the head of the council. He declines because he doesn't really want to be tied down to any particular allegiances, but Saruman kind of resents him because of Galadriel's suggestion that he should be the leader, and he ends up, of course, being the head of the White Council. So we're already getting glimpses that Saruman isn't 100% nice guy here. But after the return of Sauron to Dol Guldur, Gandalf again ends up going to Dol Guldur to check things out, and this time he finds out, yes, for sure, this is Sauron. It's not a Nazgul or just a human sorcerer. This is the enemy that we've been, worried about this whole time. But Saruman, for the time being, counsels that they don't act immediately and they let things lie for a bit because, well, he has ulterior motives, basically, is what it comes down to. But he's basically thinking that they don't want to scare him away just yet, but his real reason is he's hoping that the Ring of Power kind of surfaces itself in response to Sauron's presence, because he's learned that it was lost in the Gladden Fields, which is not too far from Dol Guldur, and he's hoping that it will be revealed and then he can claim it for himself. Saruman at this point is basically telling him, look, well, it fell into the river and it's rolled down into the sea by now, but of course he really knows better. But Elrond forebodes that it will be found again. And so there's kind of competing theories on this at this point, but the power of Sauron begins to grow more and more, and Gandalf basically eventually tells them, look, ring or no ring, sooner or later Sauron is going to be too powerful for us to do anything about it, so we should act now and make sure he's, gotten rid of. Saruman finally consents because he realizes that Sauron is also searching around the area of the Gladden Fields, and therefore he doesn't want Sauron to find it, so he'd rather get Sauron out of there where he can't easily search. So he finally agrees, okay, let's do it. So they finally attack Dol Guldur, and this would be during the events of The Hobbit. For those of you who aren't totally familiar with the chronology, this is kind of what Gandalf is up to when he keeps leaving the Hobbit and the 13 dwarves, to their own machinations. And this is what he's up to. He's going to the White Council trying to get Sauron taken care of. And so they finally do attack Dol Guldur, and Sauron flees, but it's only a feint. He's basically been setting up his return in Mordor for a while, and he just leaves in Mordor and eventually arises in even greater power there. After this, the council meets for the last time. Still, nobody knows that Saruman is a traitor, but Saruman himself basically encloses himself in Isengard and takes counsel with nobody else, basically becomes a loner. And then the ring is in fact found. Of course, we know how the ring is found. Anybody who's familiar with The Hobbit knows this. But it's basically tells us it's found under stranger circumstances than even Elrond or Gandalf could have foreseen. And because Gandalf is really the only one who pays any attention to the halflings, or Perianath as they're called in Elvish, he's the first one to realize what this thing is. And that's good for us, because otherwise Saruman would find out and we'd be in big trouble. But he, of course, learns of all this. Eventually, Sauron learns that the ring has been found again as well, because he eventually captures Gollum, tortures him for information, and he begins, his war to recover the ring and sends Nazgul out to find it. And it tells us that thus the Third Age ends in the same manner in which it began, in war with Sauron. Here we basically wrap up with essentially a bird's eye view of the plot of The Lord of the Rings. It tells us that the heir of Isildur arises in the north, and of course that's Aragorn. The sword is in fact reforged, and he becomes a great captain of men. And in the course of the war, there's battle in Rohan, where Isengard and Saruman are overthrown. The Lord of Morgul, the Witch King, is killed in battle before the gates of Minas Tirith. And eventually the host of the West sets out under the captaincy of Aragorn to attack Sauron, although it's hopeless because their armies are far too small. But it tells us that they are delivered by the small and weak, which is basically kind of what Gandalf had foreseen, because Frodo, the halfling, and his servant, and you have to remember this is all from the big, wide out perspective of kind of the elves, or maybe men, but they're basically giving us very little detail. We don't even get Sam's name in this account. They throw the ring into the fire of, Orodruin, the Mount Doom, and Sauron is basically rendered powerless, and his realm is completely destroyed. Aragorn then takes up the kingship of both Gondor and Arnor, and a new seedling of the White Tree is found by Gandalf in the mountains, and it is planted in Minas Tirith, and his realm will end up growing and recalling the glory of Numenor. It also told us earlier, I forgot to mention this, that Aragorn is, of all the heirs of Isildur, the most like Elendil, which is pretty significant. But his realms last for quite a while, and it tells us that most of all of this was achieved through the vigilance of Gandalf, who had been given the Ring of Fire by Círdan way back for, his comfort and aid in his endeavors. Círdan had basically told him, with this Ring of Fire you may rekindle, the valor of old. And he said that he would wait for Gandalf, with the last ship that would set sail. And of course, eventually, after the destruction of the ring, the power of the three rings was ended, and as a result, the good things that they were able to achieve in Rivendell and Lothlorien, kind of came to nothing. They weren't able to maintain those realms in the same way that they were before, and after this point, the elves basically see the world as old and gray, and they're now weary of Middle Earth, and so they all begin to set sail. And Gandalf does, of course, eventually come on the last ship and sails with Elrond, Galadriel, and Círdan. And it doesn't even mention, I don't think, that Frodo goes with them in the text, but of course we know that they do. And they finally sail to the west, and elves, by and large, depart Middle Earth. and it tells us that an end was come for the elves of story and of song. And that is the end of the Silmarillion. So, hope you enjoyed that video. It gives us a really big kind of thumbnail sketch of basically most of the Second Age and the Third Age, at least the key events. There's huge swaths of time that we don't really get any detail on, but it's a really interesting view because I wasn't really doing this in the course of my video, but you'll see if you read it that a lot of the names are mainly given in Elvish. Gandalf is usually referred to as Mithrandir, for instance. You get Perianath as the name of the halflings and all this. So I mean, it's a different perspective on the story, and it's definitely worth reading for that reason alone. So anyway, I hope you did enjoy that video. If you did, please do give it a thumbs up, share it around. You can follow me on Twitter if you want to keep up with videos and also get a few occasional Tolkien trivia questions. You can subscribe to the channel here. Don't forget that bell icon. You can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.